Cameron Lindsay
and Shelby
presents South Africa and Japan working together in the name of economic security. How and why is economic security more imperative to states than ideological likeness when determining cooperative alliances?
To understand the importance of economic security, you need to define economic security. During the Cold War, economic security was clearly defined by the economic protection from competition coming from opposing countries. This limits cooperation among states.
With the end of the Cold War, a state's economic security has become a more conceptual issue. Each state has its own perception of what economic security entails, and each state has their own way of obtaining economic security. Even so, economic security is commonly qualified by the protection and maintenance of a state's economy on a state level and standard of living on a more social level.
Given these aspects, a state's economic security has become an international concern. As states become more interdependent, the condition of one's country's economy will create a ripple effect in the rest of the world's economy. Economic security is important in maintaining a state's power and legitimacy. E.H. Carr explains in his book, Politics, Power, and Morality, economic strength has always been an instrument of political power. Economic security enforces a stronger economy, which increases the power and legitimacy of a state. Economic security is also important in protecting people from any existential insecurity. This form of security ensures people have infrastructure, access to health, education, living spaces, information, work, and social protection.
A lack of these commodities in a state leads to widespread insecurity, which can lead to conflict. As the world becomes more interconnected due to an increase in globalization, especially in the last 2 decades, cooperation among states has become necessary in maintaining economic security. That being said, where do ideologies come into factor? Ideologies are a system of ideas and ideals, especially one that forms the basis for economic and political theory or policy. When we think about cooperation and alliances among states, who countries choose to have relations with has more to do with means of obtaining and conserving economic security and less with ideological likeness. Ideologies that create a state's identity affect other state leaders' understanding of likely security threats. Therefore, like ideologies seem to ensure support or protection of a country's international or domestic interests when choosing a cooperative alliance.
This is not necessarily true. Alexander Wendt explains in Anarchy is What States Make of It that states define their interests in the process of defining situations. A state's ideology does not affect their cooperation if there are perceived benefits in cooperating. Both countries are able to see past their differences in the hopes of furthering each country's economic security by means of trade. Robert Jervis believes the world is anarchic and cooperation is unlikely due to countries' desire to only satisfy their self-interests. He explains in Cooperation Under the Security Dilemma, the lack of an international sovereign not only permits wars to occur but also makes it difficult for states that are satisfied with the status quo to arrive at goals that they recognize as being in their common interests. Jervis is under the impression that a country can only successfully cooperate if they have similar ideologies. However, the cooperation among South Africa and Japan proves otherwise. Though South Africa and Japan have conflicting ideologies, cooperation is a must for either country's survival. Japan is limited on essential resources. Thus, Japan has no choice but to cooperate with a state that is rich in resources such as South Africa. The cooperation amongst these two countries exposes the faults in Jervis's argument. First and foremost, conflicting ideologies does not necessarily have to interfere with cooperation. Second, resource scarcity forces countries to cooperate, and there is no such thing as a world where every country is completely independent from each other.
Case study: South Africa and Japan. South Africa have maintained a close strategic economic relationship with each other. South Africa and Japan are not only thousands of miles away from each other, their beliefs and principles differ as well. Yet, they are still able to cooperate to further reinforce their economic security. As you can see in the chart, there are several differences between the ideologies of South Africa and Japan.
South Africa is heterogeneous, meaning they are a diverse country. whereas Japan is homogeneous, which means they lack diversity. South Africa was formerly colonized by the British up until the 20th century. Japan was established in 660 BCE. South Africa officially gained its independence in 1961, making it only 55 years old. Japan was established over 1500 years ago. South Africa is rich in resources such as diamonds, gold, coal, and platinum. Japan, on the other hand, lacks these essential resources. Thus, Japan relies on other countries to export resources to them. The social status of South Africans is based on the color caste system, meaning white people usually have more money than black people. The social status of Japanese people is hereditary. South Africa entails a more Western ideology, whereas Japan is more Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism rejects superstitious and mystical elements of Taoism and Buddhism. South Africa has a population of 52.8 million people, and Japan has a population of 127 million people. The ideologies of South Africa and Japan are drastically different, however, they still manage a stable economic relationship. This chart depicts a comparison of Japan and South Africa using social psychologist Gert Hofstede's 6D model for analyzing countries' ideologies. There are stark differences in each country's masculinity, which indicates that society is driven by competition, achievement, and success, as well as uncertainty avoidance, which has to do with preparedness for uncertain events in a state. Society is also driven by long-term orientation, which has to do with how societies use the past in dealing with challenges of the present and future. Bilateral trade between South Africa and Japan began to expand in 1922, after full diplomatic relations were established that year. Natasha Skidmore states, South Africa was faced with growing international isolation and needed to diversify its trade partners. While Japan's growing economy lacked the raw materials needed to sustain it, Africa, and more specifically South Africa, was rich in raw materials, and so it was in Japan's strategic interest to pursue trade relations with South Africa.
South Africa is rich in raw materials such as gold, coal, platinum, and diamonds, while Japan has limited resources. Japan has advanced and well-maintained infrastructure with their subway systems and extensive highways, while South Africa lacks adequate infrastructure. Using each other's assets will only benefit each country.
Summits, such as the Tokyo International Conference of Developments and the Partnership Forum, are platforms that promote cooperation between Japan and South Africa. In 2013, South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry and Japan's Mizuho Corporate Bank Ltd. have signed a cooperation agreement to promote and develop economic and industrial cooperation between the two countries.
Our trade needs to keep growing, and we're also here to meet their technology companies to see the extent to which we can learn anything from the Japanese, particularly their companies. But overall is to promote good relations between South Africa and Japan. We have wonderful relations, and we want to extend those relations and strengthen them as much as we possibly can.
These charts depict some specific exports each country send each other. The charts show that South Africa exports more raw materials, while Japan sends more manufactured goods. In the recent years, Japan has become South Africa's third largest export destination. In 2015, 4.9% of South Africa's exports went to Japan, the same percentage of exports South Africa has sent to Botswana. Today, Japanese companies are actively participating in South Africa's infrastructure programs. In all, there are 110 Japanese companies generating 150,000 jobs for both countries. This is great for South Africa's high unemployment rate. Economic security is important to every state. Countries should not let small things such as ideology interfere with the security of that state.